The restaurant was buzzing with life as the evening crowd filled the tables with laughter and quiet conversation. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished wooden floors, and the faint aroma of fresh bread mixed with the rich scent of roasting meats. It was the kind of place where people came not just to eat but to be seen, and the staff moved gracefully, carrying plates and pouring drinks with quiet efficiency. Among them was a young waitress standing just behind the service counter, her hands neatly folded and her heart quietly racing. She had learned to keep calm even when faced with demanding customers, but tonight felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. The doors swung open with a gentle chime, and immediately the room seemed to shift. A tall woman entered, her designer dress flowing as if it had been crafted specifically to command attention. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she carried herself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her eyes scanned the room with a critical gaze, pausing briefly on the chandeliers, the tables, the waitstaff. There was a small entourage with her, people who seemed to follow her every move, nodding at her remarks and laughing at things that, to the untrained eye, might not even seem funny. The waitress felt her stomach tighten as she watched her approach. She knew this would not be an ordinary table to serve. The woman approached the table by the window, where the city lights outside painted a shimmering backdrop. She gestured for the waitress to come over, and the young woman stepped forward, her movement smooth, her voice ready despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome. Can I start you off with a drink?" she asked, trying to keep her tone pleasant and professional. The heiress looked down at her with a faint smirk, one corner of her mouth lifting as though amused by the effort itself. "A drink? Isn't that a bit basic?" she said, her voice carrying a cool, dismissive tone that made the waitress's stomach drop. Her entourage giggled quietly, as if this was a performance they had seen many times before. The waitress swallowed hard, keeping her composure. "Perhaps something special, then? A cocktail of your choice?" she suggested, hoping to redirect the situation to something she could manage. The heiress leaned back slightly, crossing her legs and fixing the waitress with a gaze that seemed to weigh her from head to toe. "Special? I suppose I could trust you to choose something, but it better be interesting. Surprising. Not boring," she said, her voice dripping with challenge. The waitress nodded, forcing a small smile as she mentally noted the orders she would need to recommend later. She excused herself and quickly moved to the bar, trying to calm the flutter in her chest. She had served many customers, some picky, some critical, but there was something about this woman's presence that made the air itself feel heavier. As the waitress returned with a carefully prepared drink, she tried to keep her movements fluid, professional, and unshaken. The heiress's eyes followed her, analyzing every step, every gesture. "Interesting choice," she said after a brief sip, the words tinged with amusement and a trace of skepticism. She looked around the restaurant as if daring anyone to judge her, then back at the waitress. "Tell me, do you do this often? Serve people who might not even notice your efforts?" she asked, her tone light but laced with condescension. The waitress took a deep breath. She had practiced her polite responses many times in her head, but the real moment never quite matched the rehearsed lines. "I do my best to make sure everyone has a good experience," she replied softly. Her voice was steady, but the heiress's gaze was sharp like a magnifying glass, catching every small tremor of hesitation. The heiress laughed then, a sound that was bright but carried an edge. The kind of laugh that made others feel small without a single cruel word. Dinner orders were taken, and the waitress moved around the table, jotting down requests and suggestions. Each time she leaned in to note a preference, the heiress would make some comment, a flicker of mockery hidden behind a practiced smile. It could have been something as simple as the way the waitress held the notepad, or the way her pen clicked against the paper. Every small movement was observed and somehow judged. Despite this, the waitress continued her work, focusing on each detail, trying not to let her anxiety show. She moved from table to table, attending to other customers, but the tension at that one table seemed to radiate across the entire restaurant. The heiress's laughter and comments drew attention from other diners. A few glanced over with polite curiosity, some whispering to their companions. The waitress felt the weight of the stares, but she refused to let it control her. She had learned long ago that confidence could come from inner composure, and she clung to that now, even as the heiress's amusement seemed designed to test her patience. Every time she returned to the table with a dish or a refill, she noticed the tiny smirk, the sparkle of mockery in the heiress's eyes. And yet, she maintained her calm, her smile, her quiet professionalism. The heiress's conversation continued, filled with light, seemingly harmless remarks that carried undercurrents of critique. She commented on the decor, on the choice of music, even on the angle of the candlelight. Each observation was tinged with a sense of superiority, a subtle reminder that she believed herself to be above the ordinary. The waitress listened politely, occasionally nodding, carefully avoiding any sign of irritation. She knew that engaging directly in argument or defensiveness would only fuel the heiress's amusement. Instead, she focused on anticipating needs, adjusting the service with grace, moving with the rhythm of the restaurant as best as she could. As the courses arrived, the heiress inspected each plate with exaggerated interest. She commented on presentation, texture, and even the choice of garnish. The waitress responded with factual, neutral explanations, highlighting the chef's care and attention without offering personal opinion. Occasionally, the heiress's laughter cut through, sharp and ringing, causing the waitress to steady herself and take a slow breath. It was a delicate balance, attentive but not overly familiar, polite but not submissive. The waitress felt a sense of determination growing within her, a quiet resolve not to be diminished by arrogance. Other diners were beginning to notice the interaction. Some whispered to each other, curious about the dynamic at that table. The heiress seemed to enjoy the attention, feeding off it, her laugh growing louder, her remarks sharper. And yet the waitress moved through it all with a steady calm, ensuring that every detail of the dining experience was flawless. There was a quiet dignity in her actions, a demonstration that professionalism and composure could withstand even the most challenging personalities. As dessert was offered, the heiress leaned back and tilted her head, watching the waitress with an expression that was a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Do you always handle people like me so patiently?" she asked, her tone light but carrying an edge. The waitress smiled gently. "I try to make sure everyone enjoys their meal." "That's my main goal," she replied, her voice calm, her words simple but sincere. The heiress laughed again, this time softer. But the amusement remained, as if acknowledging the waitress's quiet strength without admitting it openly. The evening continued with the subtle tension between them, the heiress's laughter and remarks against the waitress's unwavering composure. There was an unspoken understanding forming, though neither acknowledged it directly. The heiress tested boundaries and the waitress met each challenge with professionalism, kindness, and patience. It was a delicate dance, one that required attention, restraint, and a deep sense of calm. Despite the heiress's sharp words, the waitress maintained her focus, her inner poise, and her quiet pride in her work. By the time the final plates were cleared, the room was settling into a calm evening rhythm. The chandeliers reflected softly on the polished surfaces, and the staff moved with practiced efficiency. The heiress leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk still lingering, but the sparkle of amusement in her eyes was softer now. The waitress took a final deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly, and offered a polite smile. She had navigated the evening with grace, professionalism, and patience, leaving no trace of irritation despite the challenging presence she had faced. The night was far from over, and the young waitress knew that anything could happen next. But in that moment she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had met arrogance with dignity, mockery with composure, and laughter with quiet resilience. It was not a victory shouted aloud, but a small, meaningful triumph, one that would stay with her long after the last customer had left and the lights of the restaurant dimmed for the night. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted slightly as the main course was served. The polished silverware glinted under the soft lighting, and the rich aromas of roasted meats and fresh vegetables filled the air. The heiress leaned forward, inspecting each plate as if searching for some tiny flaw. Every detail mattered to her, and she did not hesitate to voice her opinions even if they came across as sharp or critical. The waitress moved carefully, serving each dish with precision, making sure nothing spilled or upset the careful arrangement of the table. She felt the tension build with each passing moment, but she focused on her task, letting professionalism guide her actions. The heiress's entourage murmured their agreement with her remarks, laughing at her small jokes and subtle digs. She seemed to take delight in pointing out things that were, for the most part, normal, but framed them in a way that suggested they were unusual or lacking. The waitress's hands moved swiftly, pouring water and wine, adjusting the placement of napkins, and responding to every small request with patience. She could feel the eyes of the heiress on her constantly, as if measuring her every move, judging her worth in small, unspoken ways. At one point, the heiress leaned back and looked around the restaurant, drawing attention to herself. She whispered comments to her friends loud enough that nearby diners could hear, about the furniture, the lighting, and even the way the staff moved. The waitress tried not to flinch. She had encountered difficult customers before, but there was a sharpness to this woman that was different, a kind of arrogance that could shake even the most composed servers. Yet she remained steady, taking deep breaths and continuing her work without complaint. The heiress then leaned over her plate, examining a piece of meat closely. "Is this really the best you can do?" she asked, her voice light but edged with critique. The waitress smiled politely, knowing that arguing would only worsen the tension. "The chef takes great care to prepare each dish with the freshest ingredients," she said, keeping her tone calm and neutral. The heiress snorted lightly but said nothing further, shifting her attention back to her companions. The waitress let out a silent sigh of relief, feeling the pressure momentarily lift. Throughout the evening, the heiress continued to make small, cutting remarks. She commented on the way the bread was cut, the angle of the candles, and the height of the wine glasses. Each observation was a subtle test, designed to see how the waitress would react. The young woman maintained her composure, moving gracefully around the table, never allowing frustration or embarrassment to show. She knew that keeping calm was the only way to survive this encounter without giving the heiress the satisfaction of a reaction. Other diners watched the interaction with quiet curiosity. Some whispered to each other, wondering what had caused the woman to behave so boldly. Others simply observed, intrigued by the dynamic unfolding before them. The waitress noticed the glances, but she refused to be distracted. Her focus remained on her work, on ensuring that every detail was attended to, and on maintaining her dignity, despite the challenging presence she was facing. As the meal progressed, the heiress's laughter became more frequent. She seemed to find amusement in small things, the way the waitress placed a napkin, the speed at which a glass was refilled, even the polite phrasing of a question. Her entourage laughed with her, creating a bubble of attention that felt both isolating and intimidating. The waitress moved within this bubble, carefully balancing the act of providing excellent service while maintaining a calm demeanor. Each time she approached the table, she reminded herself to breathe and keep her focus on the task rather than the judgmental eyes watching her. At one point, the heiress picked up a fork and gestured vaguely at the plate. "Tell me, do you always serve people like me? Or is this a special occasion?" she asked, her tone playful yet pointed. The waitress's lips curved into a soft, polite smile. "I serve all my guests with care," she replied simply. The heiress's smirk deepened, clearly amused by the straightforward answer. The young woman felt a small sense of satisfaction, knowing she had responded without giving in to irritation or defensiveness. The heiress continued to test boundaries, commenting on the service and making small, seemingly harmless but pointed remarks. The waitress handled each one with patience and a calm professionalism that began to draw subtle attention from other diners. There was a quiet strength in her composure, a resilience that seemed to shine through in her actions even when words failed to convey it. She moved with care, ensuring that each plate was perfect. Each glass was full and each detail was attended to, all while enduring the subtle mockery and arrogance directed her way. Despite the challenging atmosphere, the waitress began to notice small moments of humanity within the heiress's behavior. Occasionally a laugh would soften, a glance would linger, and she sensed that behind the arrogance there was curiosity, perhaps even admiration for the calm and dignity displayed. The young woman did not let herself dwell on this realization, instead focusing on the immediate tasks at hand, ensuring that every detail of the dining experience was flawless. The heiress's remarks gradually shifted from overt mockery to subtle challenges, testing the waitress's patience and professionalism in quieter ways. She would ask questions that required thoughtful responses, comment on the presentation of dishes, and observe the waitress's movements with careful attention. Each interaction was a delicate dance, one that required the young woman to balance politeness with assertiveness, attention with discretion. She met each challenge with grace, letting her actions speak louder than any words. The restaurant's ambiance continued around them, the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faint strains of background music creating a warm, inviting environment. The waitress moved through this space with purpose and calm, attending to other tables while keeping an eye on the challenging table. She anticipated needs before they were requested, adjusted settings with precision, and offered suggestions with gentle confidence. Each action reinforced her composure, demonstrating a quiet mastery of her craft. By the time the main course was nearly finished, the heiress's laughter had lessened slightly, replaced by a thoughtful, almost curious expression. She observed the waitress with a different kind of attention, one that suggested a faint acknowledgement of the young woman's skill and composure. The waitress continued her work with quiet dignity, noting the change but not allowing it to distract her from her responsibilities. She had survived the initial tests of patience and professionalism, and now a new phase of the interaction was beginning, one less about confrontation and more about observation. As the final bites were taken and plates cleared, the heiress leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but her gaze still attentive. She had spent the evening testing, observing, and laughing, but now there was a subtle shift, a quiet recognition of the composure and dignity she had encountered. The waitress, aware of the change, maintained her calm, offering polite smiles and gentle nods, ensuring the table remained perfectly attended. The meal had been a test, a challenge, and an experience that left both women aware of each other in new ways. The heiress had exercised her sharp tongue and wit, attempting to unsettle and amuse, while the waitress had met every challenge with patience, composure, and quiet strength. The evening had not ended in confrontation, but in a subtle acknowledgement of skill and dignity, a silent understanding that sometimes the quietest strength is the most powerful. As the restaurant settled into a quieter rhythm, the young waitress felt a sense of accomplishment. She had navigated the complexities of a challenging guest with grace and professionalism, maintaining her composure and confidence throughout. The heiress, though still commanding attention with her presence, had been met with patience and dignity that left a lasting impression. It was a lesson in resilience, in the quiet power of calmness, and in the enduring impact of professionalism in the face of arrogance. The soft hum of the restaurant continued, but a new sound began to emerge, delicate and almost magical. In the corner, a pianist had begun to play, fingers gliding across the keys with skill and passion. The melody was soft at first, barely rising above the ambient noise, but it carried a certain weight, a kind of quiet power that made people pause. The waitress heard it first, standing behind the counter for a brief moment as her tray waited on the side. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the notes fill the space around her. There was something calming and enchanting in the music, a feeling that seemed to touch even the edges of the most crowded room. The heiress, too, noticed the change, though she tried to hide it. At first, she leaned back in her chair, letting the music float around her, slightly skeptical. She glanced at her companions, their expressions curious, but her eyes kept drifting back to the pianist. Something about the sound made the world outside her table fade, drawing attention inward, toward the subtle beauty of the notes. It was not something she could mock or dismiss easily, and for the first time in the evening she found herself silent, listening. The waitress watched her closely, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness running through her. She had served many difficult customers, but this moment felt different. The music seemed to slow time, to change the energy in the room. The heiress, who had been laughing and speaking sharply just minutes before, now appeared thoughtful, almost reflective. The young woman felt a quiet sense of hope, sensing that something extraordinary might happen if the music continued. The pianist's hands moved faster, yet each note carried precision and emotion. The melody rose and fell, gentle yet commanding, filling the corners of the restaurant. The heiress's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the depth of feeling in the music. It was as though each note was speaking directly to her, unraveling thoughts and emotions she had long ignored. She shifted slightly in her chair, her posture softening, the sharp edge of her arrogance blurring for the first time. The waitress took a deep breath and moved toward the heiress's table with the next course. Her hands were steady, her movements calm, and yet she felt the weight of the moment pressing lightly against her chest. She placed the plates with careful precision, feeling the subtle vibrations of the music as if it were guiding her actions. The heiress looked at the food briefly, then back at the pianist, completely absorbed. The entourage exchanged quiet glances, sensing a change in the energy that was beyond their understanding. With each passing moment, the melody grew more intense, yet retained its soft, haunting beauty. It was not loud or overwhelming, but it demanded attention, tugging at the heart without forcing it. The heiress leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, fingers tapping unconsciously in time with the music. Her smirk, so constant and rehearsed, had disappeared, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity and wonder. The waitress could hardly believe the change, yet she felt a subtle warmth in her chest, a quiet relief that the evening had taken an unexpected turn. The pianist's expression was focused yet serene, completely absorbed in the music. The notes seemed to tell a story, one of longing, of beauty, of moments unnoticed in the rush of life. The waitress watched the heiress, noting the subtle changes, the slight softening of her eyes, the slow exhale as if tension were leaving her body, and the way her gaze lingered, unguarded and open. It was a rare vulnerability, one that the young woman had rarely seen in someone so accustomed to command and attention. As the music reached a gentle crescendo, the waitress noticed a small movement in the heiress's hands. They rested on the table, fingers curled slightly, as if she were reaching for something she could not name. Her usual laughter and sharp remarks were gone, replaced by a silent absorption in the beauty that surrounded her. The waitress, carrying the next dish, felt a sense of awe herself. The music had transformed the atmosphere, creating a shared experience of quiet wonder that united everyone present, even if they did not fully realize it. Other diners had begun to notice the change too. Some looked toward the pianist, some glanced at the heiress, and others simply closed their eyes, letting the music carry them away. The restaurant, once filled with chatter and subtle tension, now existed in a different space entirely. The waitress moved carefully among the tables, aware of the soft energy shifting in the room. She poured wine, cleared dishes, and adjusted settings with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, as if guided by the melody itself. The heiress remained seated, her posture relaxed and attentive. She did not speak, did not laugh, and did not make the sharp comments that had defined the earlier hours. Instead, she allowed herself to be present, to feel the nuances of the music as it wound through the room. Occasionally, her eyes met the waitress's, a subtle acknowledgement of the shared experience without words. It was a silent understanding, a connection formed not through conversation, but through the shared human response to beauty and emotion. The melody shifted, becoming softer, more intimate. The pianist's fingers danced lightly over the keys, creating a delicate tapestry of sound. The waitress paused briefly, listening as she adjusted the placement of utensils on a nearby table. She felt her heart lift slightly, touched by the raw beauty of the moment. The heiress, too, seemed moved, a faint shiver passing through her as the music spoke directly to something deep within her. It was as if the piano had unlocked a part of her that had been hidden, a side she rarely allowed others to see. Time seemed to slow, each note lingering in the air longer than it should, each pause filled with emotion. The waitress moved with care, attentive to her duties yet fully immersed in the sensory experience surrounding her. The heiress's eyes followed the pianist, her expression one of quiet fascination, almost disbelief. She shifted slightly, leaning in as if to catch every nuance of the melody, every subtle shift in tempo and tone. The room had transformed from a place of tension and hierarchy into a shared moment of vulnerability and connection. The waitress could feel the energy building as the music reached a subtle, emotional peak. The heiress's hand rested lightly on the table, fingers tracing small patterns absent-mindedly, unaware of the gesture. Her usual confidence was replaced by a gentle attentiveness, a rare openness that made the waitress pause for a brief, unspoken recognition of the power of music. The pianist's hands moved with effortless grace, the final notes weaving a gentle conclusion that seemed to hang in the air long after the keys were still. As the last note faded, the restaurant returned to its normal rhythm, but something had shifted irrevocably. The heiress exhaled slowly, a faint smile tugging at her lips, soft and unguarded. Her eyes lingered on the waitress for a moment, a subtle acknowledgement of the shared experience, before she looked away toward the city lights outside the window. The young woman felt a small, quiet triumph, Understanding that the moment had broken through the barriers of arrogance, even if only briefly, the pianist's performance had ended, but the impact lingered. The diners resumed their conversations, but the tone was different, softened by the brief enchantment they had all shared. The waitress moved among the tables, clearing dishes and attending to guests, but her heart remained lifted, buoyed by the realization that she had witnessed something extraordinary. The heiress, once so commanding and unapproachable, had allowed herself to be touched, to feel, and to recognize the subtle beauty that surrounded her. The evening continued, but the energy at that table had transformed. The heiress was no longer focused on testing, on mocking, or on commanding attention. Instead, there was a quiet reflection, a curiosity, and a newfound respect for the atmosphere and the people around her. The waitress maintained her calm professionalism, aware of the subtle shift and careful to honor the moment without intrusion. It was a delicate balance, a dance of presence and service that required awareness and grace. As the room settled into a peaceful rhythm, the waitress allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had navigated an evening filled with challenge, arrogance, and subtle tension, and now witnessed a transformation that felt deeply human. The music had done what words and gestures could not. It had softened the sharp edges, touched the heart, and reminded everyone present of the quiet power of beauty and emotion. The heiress, once a figure of dominance and mockery, now seemed approachable, thoughtful, and unexpectedly human. The young woman continued her work, moving from table to table with a calm efficiency, her movements almost in tune with the lingering melody that still seemed to echo in the corners of the room. She felt a sense of quiet pride, understanding that professionalism, patience, and grace had allowed her not just to serve, but to witness a moment of genuine transformation. The heiress, still seated, allowed herself to be present, her earlier arrogance softened by the emotional resonance of the piano's music. The connection between them, subtle and wordless, had created a shared experience that neither could forget. The soft, lingering notes of the piano seemed to have transformed the atmosphere entirely. The heiress sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the pianist, her posture relaxed for the first time that evening. The sharp confidence and mocking laughter were gone, replaced with a curiosity that seemed almost childlike in its intensity. She observed the way the pianist's fingers moved effortlessly, the way each note carried emotion, telling a story without words. Something about it reached deep within her, stirring feelings she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. The waitress, carrying the next course, moved carefully through the tables, yet she too felt the weight of the moment. The music had changed everything, softening the edges of the room, creating a shared sense of awe. As she approached the heiress's table, she noticed the slight shift in expression, the softened eyes and the gentle exhale. There was no smirk, no sharp comment, just a quiet presence that demanded attention in an entirely new way. She placed the plates down gently, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. Feeling the music guide her steps, the heiress looked at the waitress briefly, a flicker of surprise in her gaze, as if realizing for the first time that the young woman had maintained her composure all evening. There was a silent acknowledgement, subtle and unspoken, that this was no ordinary server. The waitress returned the glance with a polite smile, understanding the significance of the moment without words. The room felt suspended in time, the gentle hum of conversation replaced by the emotional resonance of the music and the quiet tension that still lingered at the table. The pianist's hands moved faster now, the melody rising with intensity, weaving a story of longing, reflection, and quiet beauty. The heiress's posture shifted slightly forward, fingers tapping lightly on the table, drawn into the rhythm without even realizing it. The young waitress, moving to refill a glass nearby, caught the subtle change and felt a quiet thrill. This was more than a performance. It was a revelation. The music was touching hearts, softening the barriers built by years of arrogance and carefully crafted defenses. As the melody swelled, the heiress's expression changed again. Her eyes were wide, reflecting a mixture of surprise and admiration. She had spent much of the evening asserting control, mocking and testing boundaries, but now she seemed powerless to resist the emotional pull of the music. The waitress felt a small sense of satisfaction and relief, recognizing that the moment had shifted entirely. The heiress was no longer the untouchable figure she had been moments ago. She was simply a human being experiencing something extraordinary. The pianist's fingers danced across the keys, moving from soft, gentle notes to more urgent, passionate phrases. The music carried a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the entire room, touching every corner and every listener. The waitress moved carefully among the tables, clearing dishes and adjusting settings. Yet her movements seemed in sync with the melody, almost as if the music were guiding her steps. She glanced toward the heiress, noticing her hands resting lightly on the table, fingers curling unconsciously to the rhythm. The sharp laughter of earlier hours was gone, replaced with a quiet focus that suggested a rare vulnerability. For a moment, the heiress closed her eyes, letting the sound envelop her completely. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, being moved without control, without the ability to command attention or manipulate the situation. The waitress watched this transformation, noting the subtle changes in posture and expression, the softness in the heiress's eyes, and the faint tension leaving her shoulders. It was a powerful reminder of how simple beauty, like music, could reach deeper than wealth or status ever could. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, more intimate, almost as if it were whispering secrets. The heiress leaned in slightly, her chin resting lightly on her hands, absorbing every nuance. The waitress, moving past the table, felt a gentle pull herself, a sense that the music was not just filling the room, but touching hearts individually. The other diners seemed affected too, some closing their eyes, some leaning back in thought, all united by the quiet power of the piano. The heiress's hand moved slightly, brushing against the edge of the table as if seeking a connection with the music, something beyond the ordinary control she always sought. The waitress noticed this and felt a quiet empathy. She had witnessed arrogance, mockery, and dismissiveness all evening. Yet here was a woman, suddenly humanized by beauty and emotion. It was a reminder that no matter how powerful someone seemed, they too could be touched, softened, and inspired by something genuine and pure. The pianist's hands moved with precision, bringing the melody to an emotional peak, without breaking the gentle flow. The heiress opened her eyes slowly, letting the notes sink fully into her awareness. Her lips parted slightly, a small intake of breath that hinted at awe, at recognition, at an unexpected humility. The waitress, standing nearby, felt a quiet joy, understanding that the evening had shifted from tension and challenge to reflection and admiration. The air itself seemed lighter, charged with something intangible yet profoundly human. As the music softened, the heiress shifted her gaze, noticing the young waitress who had maintained calm and dignity throughout. There was a subtle recognition in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that this woman had held her own without arrogance or submission. The waitress returned the glance with a small, respectful smile, aware of the power of unspoken communication in that delicate moment. For the first time that evening, the heiress seemed aware of the quiet strength in front of her, a strength that did not rely on mockery or status. The pianist's final notes lingered, creating a hush that felt both fragile and profound. The heiress exhaled slowly, letting the sound settle within her, a quiet smile touching her lips. The waitress moved to adjust a nearby table, yet her attention remained subtly on the heiress, noting the transformation that had occurred. The sharp edge of arrogance had softened, replaced by curiosity, reflection, and a newfound awareness of beauty and emotion. It was a rare moment, one that left an indelible mark on the atmosphere of the restaurant. Other diners gradually returned to their own conversations, yet there was a lingering sense of connection, an unspoken acknowledgement of the extraordinary experience they had shared. The waitress continued her work with grace and calm, her movements deliberate, her focus unwavering. She had navigated the complexities of a difficult guest and now witnessed something remarkable. The quiet power of art to change perspective, to soften arrogance, and to remind even the most hardened hearts of the beauty in simple moments. The heiress, still seated, allowed herself to lean back fully, her expression contemplative. She no longer observed with judgment, nor did she speak with ridicule. Instead, she seemed to absorb the world differently, noticing details she had overlooked before. The gentle flicker of candlelight, the soft rustle of the napkins, the subtle effort of the staff moving around her. The waitress, carrying a fresh glass of water to the table, felt the energy shift once again, lighter now, filled with quiet reflection and mutual recognition. The pianist had concluded, yet the effect remained. The heiress, for the first time, seemed open to experiencing more than just the surface of things, more than status or outward appearances. She observed the waitress with a new respect, subtle and wordless, recognizing the composure and dignity maintained through an evening that could have been unbearable. The waitress returned a gentle nod, acknowledging the unspoken connection forged by shared observation and the transformative power of music. Time moved gently forward, each moment now carrying a different weight. The restaurant continued its rhythm, yet the energy at that particular table had shifted permanently. The heiress was no longer the untouchable figure who wielded laughter as a weapon. She was a human being who had been touched, softened, and quietly humbled. The waitress felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that patience, calm, and quiet strength had guided the evening to a point of genuine human connection. The music had ended, but its presence lingered in every glance, every movement, every subtle shift of expression. The heiress continued to sit, absorbing the aftermath, her hands resting lightly on the table, her breathing slow and deliberate. The waitress, moving among the other tables, felt the faint echo of the moment, the quiet triumph of witnessing a transformation that words could not fully capture. The restaurant, too, seemed to breathe with the energy of a shared human experience, a reminder of how simple acts of beauty can pierce through walls built by pride and pretense. The evening pressed on, but the tension that had dominated the earlier hours was gone. The heiress's laughter, once sharp and mocking, had given way to a gentle, thoughtful presence. The waitress maintained her calm, moving with intention and grace, aware that her quiet strength had not only survived, but had played a role in the unfolding change. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible victory, one that would stay with her long after the night ended. The piano had played, and in that sound the world had shifted ever so slightly, leaving an unforgettable mark on those who were present. The music had ended, leaving a quiet stillness in the restaurant that felt almost sacred. The heiress, who had spent most of the evening commanding attention and testing patience, remained seated, her eyes tracing the faint outline of the pianist's hands as they rested on the keys. Her usual arrogance had softened, replaced by a sense of reflection and something more human, something she rarely allowed herself to feel. She was not speaking, nor was she laughing. She was simply present, fully absorbing the weight of the experience that had unfolded in front of her. The waitress, moving to the next table to clear empty dishes, stole a glance at the heiress. She noticed the subtle changes, the softened shoulders, the slightly distant gaze, the quiet exhale as if some burden had lifted. It was a stark contrast to the sharp, mocking presence that had dominated the earlier hours. The young woman felt a quiet surge of satisfaction, knowing that patience, calmness, and dignity had withstood the test of the evening and had begun to reach the heart of someone who had seemed untouchable. The heiress looked around the restaurant with a new perspective. She noticed the way the staff moved with care, the effort behind every detail she had previously dismissed, and the subtle interactions that often went unnoticed. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the world was not just a stage for her amusement and critique. There was effort, thought, and quiet beauty in the details that she had overlooked. Her eyes returned to the waitress, and she recognized the young woman's composure, her quiet confidence, and the effort it took to remain unshaken in the face of relentless scrutiny. The waitress, feeling the shift, approached the heiress's table again, this time with a gentle offer of coffee and dessert. She placed the items carefully, her hand steady, her smile soft and welcoming. The heiress took a slow sip of the coffee, savoring the warmth and the subtle aroma, and for the first time she allowed herself to acknowledge the care with which the service had been conducted. She looked at the waitress, her gaze lingering, not with mockery or critique, but with an unspoken recognition. It was a small, quiet moment, but one that spoke volumes. The atmosphere at the table had changed. The entourage, sensing the shift, quieted themselves, watching the heiress with curiosity. Her usual sharp remarks were absent, replaced with attentive observation and a reflective calm. The young waitress moved around the table with practiced ease, ensuring that every need was met without imposing, without drawing attention to herself. There was a subtle grace in her movements, a silent strength that contrasted with the soft vulnerability now visible in the heiress. The room, once filled with tension, now held a gentle, almost reverent energy. The heiress's eyes returned to the pianist, who had paused for a moment, hands resting lightly on the keys. She noticed the subtle effort in the musician's posture, the focus in each movement and the depth of emotion carried in every note. It struck her how a simple act, a melody played with skill and heart, could have such a profound effect. She felt a stirring of humility, an acknowledgement that not everything could be controlled or judged. Some things simply existed to be felt, to be experienced, and to move people in ways beyond comprehension or command. The waitress observed this quietly, noting the unspoken connection forming. She had maintained professionalism throughout the evening, meeting challenge with patience and composure. Yet now she saw the result of her efforts in a subtle human way. The heiress, who had seemed untouchable, was opening herself to genuine feeling, and the young woman had a part in guiding that transformation, not through confrontation or competition, but through quiet presence, diligence, and grace. The pianist resumed, this time with a gentle, reflective melody. The notes floated softly across the room, delicate and haunting. The heiress leaned slightly forward, listening intently, allowing the music to wash over her. Her eyes softened further, and for the first time a trace of vulnerability showed. It was not weakness, but openness, a willingness to feel, to be touched, and perhaps to understand that not all power came from wealth or status. The waitress, standing nearby to attend to the table, felt a quiet warmth, recognizing the beauty of the moment and the emotional connection forming without words. The heiress's hands rested lightly on the table, fingers tracing absent patterns as she absorbed the music. She glanced at the waitress, a faint smile appearing on her lips, tentative and unguarded. It was a recognition of strength and dignity, of composure in the face of challenge. The young woman returned the smile subtly, acknowledging the silent communication without intruding. In that brief shared glance, a story of respect, understanding, and human connection unfolded, one that required no words, only presence and authenticity. The piano melody grew slightly, carrying an emotional resonance that felt almost tangible. The heiress closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound fill her completely. She felt a mix of awe, reflection, and a strange humility, emotions she rarely allowed herself to recognize. The waitress watched carefully, aware of the subtleties in posture and expression, understanding the delicate balance of observation and non-interference. This was not a moment for words, but for witnessing, and she felt honored to be part of it. As the music softened, the heiress opened her eyes and glanced at the staff moving around the restaurant. She noticed the care in every gesture, the effort behind every movement, and the quiet dedication that had gone unnoticed before. Her gaze returned to the waitress, and she felt a quiet respect for the composure and dignity that had guided the young woman through the challenges of the evening. The subtle acknowledgement was mutual, a silent understanding that transcended social status, pride, and previous tension. The piano concluded with a gentle, lingering note that seemed to echo in the hearts of everyone present. The heiress exhaled slowly, a small, genuine smile forming, her expression softened, thoughtful. She had experienced something rare, a quiet revelation that challenged her assumptions and humbled her in a gentle, human way. The waitress, maintaining her professionalism, felt the depth of the moment, recognizing that patience, presence, and quiet strength had created an experience that words could not fully capture. The atmosphere in the restaurant remained calm, but the energy at that table had shifted permanently. The heiress no longer seemed untouchable or aloof. She was human, reflective, and aware of her own vulnerability. The waitress continued her work with care, moving smoothly between tables, aware that she had played a subtle role in guiding a transformation that required no force, only dignity and patience. The interaction between them was quiet, yet profoundly human, a reminder of how simple, genuine presence could influence even the most guarded hearts. The heiress sipped the last of her coffee and placed the cup gently on the saucer, her eyes meeting the waitress's briefly. In that glance was a shared understanding of effort and resilience, of patience and composure, and of the subtle impact of human connection. The young woman felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her calm presence had created space for reflection and humility, and that the evening had moved from tension to something deeply meaningful. As the restaurant's atmosphere returned to a gentle rhythm, the heiress remained seated for a few moments, taking in the room with a newfound awareness. She observed the staff, the diners, the pianist, and the subtle interactions that often went unnoticed. She realized that there was more to the world than dominance and control, more than mockery and wit. There was beauty, effort, and dignity in unexpected places, and she felt a stirring of respect and admiration for those who embodied it quietly and consistently. The waitress moved to clear a nearby table, carrying herself with grace yet aware of the emotional resonance that lingered. The heiress's eyes followed her briefly, a subtle acknowledgement of her composure and professionalism. There was no need for words. The understanding was silent, profound, and mutual. The young woman felt a quiet pride, knowing that patience, dignity, and a calm presence had created an impact that neither money nor status could replicate. As the evening drew to a close, the piano's soft echoes lingered in the room, a reminder of the emotional journey that had unfolded. The heiress remained thoughtful, her laughter replaced by reflection, her arrogance softened by the experience of genuine emotion. The waitress, continuing her work with careful attention, recognized the significance of the moment and the subtle connection formed through shared observation and presence. It was a rare human experience, one that left an indelible impression on both of them. The room had returned to its gentle rhythm, yet the transformation at that particular table was permanent. The heiress had been touched, humbled, and softened, and the waitress had borne witness with quiet strength and dignity. The shared human connection, unspoken yet deeply felt, was a reminder that patience, empathy, and composure could create moments of profound impact, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The evening had shifted from challenge and tension to reflection and understanding, leaving both women forever changed. The evening was winding down, and the soft glow of the chandeliers cast long shadows across the polished floors. The restaurant had quieted, the hum of conversation now gentle, almost intimate, as diners lingered over their final sips of wine and bites of dessert. The pianist had finished for the night, leaving only the echo of the last note hanging in the air, a reminder of the extraordinary performance that had touched everyone present. The heiress, seated near the window, looked out at the city lights, her expression contemplative, calm, and unlike anything the young waitress had seen earlier in the evening. The waitress approached with the final checks, her hands steady, her movements graceful. She had spent hours maintaining composure, attending to every detail, and yet she now felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She placed the check on the table with care, offering a gentle smile. The heiress met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no arrogance, no smirk, no sharp comment, just a look of genuine acknowledgement, a recognition of effort, patience, and dignity that had been present all evening. "Thank you," the heiress said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. It was brief, yet the simplicity of the words carried weight. The waitress nodded politely, her smile warm and steady. She understood the significance of this moment. The heiress, who had spent the evening testing, mocking, and commanding attention, had finally recognized and appreciated the quiet strength in front of her. No words could capture the full depth of the shared experience, but the acknowledgement was enough. The entourage shifted uncomfortably, unused to the heiress speaking with such humility and calm. They exchanged glances, silently noting the change in her demeanor. The heiress, however, seemed unaware or perhaps unconcerned with their reactions. She remained present, absorbing the atmosphere of the restaurant and the effort of those who had made the evening seamless, from the chef to the staff, and especially the young waitress who had navigated the challenges with grace. The waitress cleared the final crumbs from the table, her movements unhurried yet precise. She noticed the heiress's eyes following her, a subtle expression of curiosity and newfound respect. The young woman felt a quiet pride, understanding that this simple act, remaining calm, professional, and attentive, had created a moment of genuine connection and understanding. There was no need for dramatics, no need for confrontation. Presence and dignity had sufficed to create a lasting impression. As the heiress rose from her seat, she took a deep breath, the cool air from the window brushing against her face. She had been carried through a range of emotions over the course of the evening: arrogance, amusement, curiosity, reflection, and now something softer, more human. The waitress held the chair steady for her, and the heiress gave a small nod of appreciation, another silent acknowledgement of the service and care that had been extended. The pianist, now packing away instruments, glanced toward the table. The heiress offered a small, almost shy smile, a gesture of gratitude for the music that had transformed the evening. The waitress, observing this, felt the room shift slightly, the lingering energy of the piano notes combining with the subtle transformation of the heiress. There was a sense of shared experience, a quiet understanding that beauty, patience, and human effort had created something meaningful beyond wealth, status, or pretense. The heiress moved toward the exit, her steps measured and calm, no longer carrying the weight of judgment or superiority. She paused for a moment, turning her head toward the waitress. "You were patient tonight," she said softly, almost to herself. "Thank you." It was simple, but the sincerity behind the words made the young woman feel the depth of the impact. There was a connection, unspoken yet profound, forged not through conversation or gestures, but through shared presence and quiet resilience. The waitress offered a polite smile and a nod. "It was my pleasure," she replied. No more words were necessary. The mutual understanding lingered in the space between them. The heiress gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of farewell and stepped out into the cool night, leaving behind a subtle warmth in the room that the staff and diners could feel. Her laughter and arrogance had been replaced by reflection, respect, and a touch of humility that would not be forgotten. The young woman continued her duties, moving among the tables with grace and focus, yet the evening's events weighed lightly on her mind. She had witnessed transformation, not forced, not dramatic, but genuine and human. The power of patience, composure, and quiet dignity had created an impact that rippled through the room. Other diners, though unaware of the details, sensed the subtle change in energy, a calm that settled over the restaurant and made the final moments of the evening feel special, almost magical. The pianist finished packing, nodding to the waitress and staff, the last chords of the night still resonating in the atmosphere. The young woman felt a quiet pride, knowing that professionalism and presence had played a role in a moment of human transformation. The heiress had been touched, humbled, and quietly moved, and she had done so without force or spectacle, simply by allowing herself to feel and by recognizing the quiet strength in another. As the night progressed, the staff began to close tables and prepare for the end of service. The waitress moved with calm efficiency, her mind reflecting on the events of the evening. She had learned once again that patience and dignity could withstand the sharpest tests and create moments of unexpected beauty. The heiress's transformation was a reminder that even those who seem unapproachable or impervious could be touched by genuine human effort and kindness. The restaurant's lights dimmed gradually, the soft chandeliers casting shadows that danced across the polished surfaces. The young woman paused for a moment near the piano, looking at the now quiet instrument. She remembered the way the music had shifted the energy, the way it had softened even the most resistant heart. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for witnessing the power of music, but for the reminder that human connection, patience, and composure could leave a lasting mark. The heiress had left, but her presence lingered in a different way, a memory of transformation, of humility, and of reflection. The waitress felt a quiet contentment, knowing that the evening had ended not with conflict or ridicule, but with understanding and a subtle, shared respect. She finished her duties, ensuring the final tables were cleared and the restaurant prepared for the next day, yet the impact of the night remained vivid, a story etched in quiet human emotion. As she turned off the last lights and prepared to leave herself, the waitress paused one final time to reflect. The evening had been a challenge, a test of patience, professionalism, and composure. Yet it had also been a moment of human connection, of transformation witnessed and facilitated through quiet effort and presence. The heiress had been humbled and moved, and the young woman had seen firsthand how dignity, patience, and grace could bridge gaps that arrogance and status could not. It was a reminder that true influence comes not from words or wealth, but from the quiet strength of human presence and the ability to touch hearts without forcing the change. The night outside was calm, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. The young woman stepped out, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of the evening lift gently from her shoulders. She had witnessed something extraordinary, and though it had been subtle, it was profound. The heiress had left a changed person, a little more aware, a little more humble, a little more human, and the waitress carried with her the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had played a part in that transformation, not with confrontation or dominance, but with patience, composure, and human dignity. The night had ended, but the story, the subtle human story, would linger far longer, a testament to the quiet power of presence and understanding.